I've walked past derelict buildings all over this country that most people drive straight past without a second glance. New Zealand likes to sell you the postcard version. Milford Sound at sunrise, sheep on a green hillside, a haka for the tourists getting off the plane at Auckland, a vineyard tour through Marlborough with a glass of something cold at the end of it. That's the version everyone knows, and fair enough, it's a genuinely beautiful country, and postcards don't lie, not exactly. But behind the paddocks and the fjords there's another country, one built out of sealed military tunnels, drowned gold towns, a burned-out asylum, a profit settlement the government tried to erase, and at least one pile of stone that professional archaeologists still argue about to this day. Some of these places are locked behind gates with Department of Conservation signage warning you off. Some are locked behind nothing more than distance, weather, and a four-wheel drive track that ends more careers as tour guides than it should. And one or two of them are locked behind something closer to grief, which is its own kind of forbidden. Today I'm taking you to 15 of these places, the forbidden ruins scattered across both islands that nobody in an official capacity has ever fully explained, not properly, not in writing anyone can point to. Go on, subscribe, and I'll tell you the whole story. Number 15. The Kawau Island Copper Mine in the Hauraki Gulf, about 90 minutes north of Auckland by boat from Sandspit. Most people who go to Kawau go for Mansion House, the old residence of Governor Sir George Grey. All white weatherboard and imported peacocks strutting the lawn, kept up today by the Department of Conservation as one of the more genteel heritage sites in the country. Almost nobody walks the 15 minutes north to Bonacor Harbour to see what's left of the mine that put Kawau on the map before Grey ever bought the place from the company that ruined itself trying to work it. In the late 1840s, the Kawau Island Copper Mining Company, an Australian outfit backed by investors who never set foot on the island, sank shafts into the hillside above the harbour, chasing copper that had been spotted glinting in outcrops by early surveyors passing through the Gulf. For a few years it genuinely worked. An engine house was built to pump water out of the deepening shafts. Cornish miners were shipped in with their families on contracts that promised more than the mine ever delivered, and a whole company town grew up around the workings. Cottages, a store, even a small chapel, all built for a population that within a decade would simply not be there anymore. Then the ore seams thinned, the assays that had justified the investment stopped matching what was actually coming out of the ground, and the company collapsed financially in 1855, owing money across two colonies. The island was more or less abandoned to the bush within a decade of the first shaft being sunk. What's left today is a crumbling engine house wall, flooded shafts fenced off by the Department of Conservation for safety, and the outline of cottage foundations you can still trace in the undergrowth if you know roughly where to look and don't mind the mosquitoes. The official explanation is straightforward, and it's the one printed on the interpretation panel near the site. The copper simply wasn't there in payable quantities, a bad investment in a young colony where bad investments were common. But local historians combing through the company's surviving correspondence have pointed out that assay reports from the final working season suggested richer seams further into the hill than the company ever actually reached. Seams abandoned not because they'd run dry, but because the money to keep digging toward them had already run out first. Whether there's still copper worth having under that hill, or whether it was always more promise than substance, is something nobody has gone back to properly check in over a century and a half. The bush has had a long time to grow over the answer, and it shows no particular sign of giving it back. Number 14. North Head, at Devonport on the north shore of Auckland, looking straight back across the harbour to the city. You've probably stood on top of it. It's a popular walk, great views, and ice cream afterwards if you're doing it properly. What most visitors don't realise is that they're standing on top of a honeycomb. Beneath the grassy slopes of North Head is a network of tunnels and gun emplacements dug in stages from the 1880s right through to the Second World War, built because the colonial government was, at various points, seriously and repeatedly worried about invasion. A Russian scare in the 1880s that turned out to be baseless, then a much more credible Japanese threat 60 years later that, in the end, never reached this far south either. Fort Courtly, as the complex is officially known, held disappearing guns, heavy artillery that dropped below the parapet on a hydraulic mechanism to reload, completely out of sight and out of range of any attacking ship's return fire, along with underground magazines, plotting rooms, engine rooms, and barracks tunnels connecting the whole thing together beneath the hill. Some of that network is open to the public today, lit with electric bulbs and signposted for tourists who come away thinking they've seen the whole thing. A significant part of it has not been open in living memory. Sections have been sealed off by Heritage New Zealand and the Department of Conservation, officially for safety reasons: unstable rock in places, old ventilation shafts that were never properly capped, structural concerns in tunnels that, by the department's own admission in a 2015 conservation report, haven't been comprehensively surveyed since the guns went silent for good. Former volunteer guides have spoken, mostly off the record and mostly with a shrug, rather than any sense of drama, about sealed steel doors leading to sections that simply don't appear on any publicly released plan of the complex. Doors that predate the current public tour route, and that nobody currently working the site has ever been given a key to. The official position is that this is standard heritage risk management, nothing more. And yet, in all the decades since the fort was decommissioned, nobody has ever published a complete, unredacted plan of exactly what's down there, and the people who might still remember are getting fewer every year. Number 13. The Albert Park air raid tunnels, right in the middle of Auckland's central city. Underneath a park most office workers cross on their lunch break without a thought for what's beneath their feet. During the Second World War, with fear of Japanese attack running genuinely high along the whole Pacific coast after Pearl Harbor, the Auckland City Council commissioned a network of air raid shelters carved directly into the volcanic rock beneath the park. Tunnels wide enough to hold several hundred civilians in an emergency that, in the end, mercifully never came. When the war ended, the tunnels were sealed and largely forgotten by everyone except the council engineers responsible for them, resurfacing in public memory only when construction work nearby, or the occasional urban exploration story online, reopened the conversation for a news cycle before it faded again. They are officially closed to the public today, accessible only on rare heritage open days organised by the council, if that. Engineers who've been inside more recently, as part of structural assessments tied to nearby university building work, describe sections that flood seasonally, sections with air quality poor enough to require breathing apparatus before entry, and at least one stretch that dead ends abruptly in solid rock, where the original 1942 plans clearly show it should have connected through to a second entrance. An entrance that, according to those same plans, was either never finished before the war ended and funding dried up, or was finished, and then deliberately backfilled afterward for reasons the council's own surviving records from the period simply don't specify. A city built its safety net underground in a hurry, under real fear, and then buried the paperwork explaining exactly how it was built along with it once the fear had passed. Number 12. Wrights Hill Fortress, in the hills above Karori, Wellington. If Albert Park's tunnels are a rumour most Aucklanders have half heard, Wrights Hill is a rumour most Wellingtonians haven't heard at all, despite it sitting almost directly above a suburb full of people who drive past the access road every single day without knowing what it leads to. Built during the Second World War as part of the coastal defence of Wellington Harbour, it's an underground fortress in the fullest sense, plotting rooms, engine rooms, magazines and gun emplacements built to house 6-inch naval guns capable of reaching enemy ships far out past the harbour heads before they ever came close enough to threaten the capital. The guns themselves were never fired in anger, not once. The Japanese threat that justified the fortress's construction never reached Cook Strait, and by the time the tunnels were finished in 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had already turned decisively away from any real prospect of a landing this far south. What remains is one of the most structurally intact underground military complexes in the country, kept alive today, largely through the unpaid work of a small volunteer heritage society that opens it to the public on select weekends throughout the year, generator-lit and guided by people who learned the tunnel's layout from the last of the men who actually served there. The rest of the year it's locked, and Wellington City Council has been notably quiet about long-term plans for a site that occupies a genuinely enormous footprint of tunnels beneath residential land, land that, in any other context, would be worth a great deal to developers. Structural engineers who have assessed the site for the Heritage Society have noted sections mapped clearly in wartime construction documents that have since been bricked up entirely, for reasons the Council's own heritage assessment describes, in language that raises more questions than it answers, only as historical alterations, cause undetermined. A fortress built to face an enemy that never came, sealed now against an audience that never really got the chance to see the whole of it properly. Number 11. Kingseat Hospital, south of Auckland near Karaka, on land chosen in the 1920s specifically for its distance from town. Kingseat opened in 1932 as a psychiatric hospital in an era when institutions like this were built deliberately isolated, on the prevailing medical theory that distance from ordinary society was itself part of the treatment rather than an unfortunate side effect of it. For 70 years it operated as a working asylum, treating tens of thousands of patients under the mental health policies of its time. Policies that, read against today's standards, include documented practices most New Zealanders would now recognise as genuinely brutal. When it finally closed in the early 2000s as part of a nationwide shift toward community-based mental health care, much of the site was left standing exactly as it had been on the day the last ward emptied. And for years afterward, the vacant buildings became one of the most photographed and most trespassed abandoned sites in the country, a magnet for urban explorers with cameras and, less charitably, for vandals. Sections have since been repurposed into a film and television production complex, one that has leaned unapologetically into the eerie institutional architecture as a ready-made backdrop for exactly the kind of horror content the building's actual history might reasonably discourage rather than invite. But several of the original wards remain sealed and derelict behind chain-link fencing, officially closed for asbestos remediation and structural risk that nobody has yet found the budget to address. Former staff, in interviews given to local historical societies rather than any official inquiry, have talked about patient records that were never fully accounted for at the point of closure. Files that should, by law, have been transferred intact to the Ministry of Health's Central Archive, but that a subsequent unrelated Ombudsman's review of hospital record keeping from the same era found to be incomplete on arrival across more than one closed institution. Whether that's simple bureaucratic sloppiness at the end of a long institutional life, or something closer to a decision that certain records were better off never quite making the trip, is a question that has been asked more than once and answered satisfactorily by nobody. Number 10. Tangarakau, in the Gorge Country between Taranaki and the King Country, on a road so remote that GPS systems still occasionally lose confidence in it halfway through. Tangarakau existed for one reason only, a railway line. The Stratford-Okahukura line was one of the most expensive and difficult railway projects this country has ever attempted. Driven through country so steep, so unstable, and so thickly forested that construction dragged on for the better part of 3 decades, from the early 1900s through to 1932, far longer than any comparable line elsewhere in New Zealand. A whole town grew up along the way to house the men building it, and their families, several hundred people at its peak. A school with 2 teachers, a store, a hall for dancers on a Saturday night, all of it strung along a single narrow road in a gorge the sun barely reaches for half the year in winter. When the line was finally completed in 1932, decades behind its original schedule and wildly over its original budget, the workforce that had built it simply had nowhere left to work, and the town emptied out almost as fast as it had filled, families moving on to whatever construction project came next. Today, Tangarakau is close to nothing at all. A handful of house foundations reclaimed by Blackberry, an old cemetery with headstones for infants and young men who died in construction accidents the official inquest records list only briefly, and bush closing back in over a valley that once held several hundred people going about ordinary lives. The railway line itself, one of the most expensive per kilometre ever constructed in New Zealand at the time, saw so little freight traffic in its later decades that it was permanently mothballed by the national rail operator. a piece of infrastructure that consumed a small fortune in public money and outlived its own reason for existing within a single working lifetime. The official explanation for the line's underuse points to changing freight patterns and the rise of road transport after the war. The people who remember Tangarakau before it disappeared, or who grew up hearing about it from parents who lived there, tend to put it more simply. They built a road to nowhere at enormous cost, and then the somewhere at the end of it quietly vanished too, almost as if the whole project had been designed to disappear from the start. Number 9. Ohura, a little further north in King Country Coal Country, on the road most people only take because the main highway is closed for roadworks. Ohura is not technically a ghost town. People still live there, and that fact is part of what makes it unsettling, rather than simply sad, in the way a fully abandoned place can be. It grew around underground coal mining in the early 20th century, reached a population in the low thousands at its peak in the 1930s and 40s, with its own picture theatre, hotel, and a main street built to a scale that assumed the town would keep growing indefinitely. Then it went into a decline so steady and so quiet, over such a long stretch of decades, that by the time it made international headlines in the 2000s, for a story that ran in an Australian newspaper about houses selling in Ohura for as little as $1 New Zealand, sometimes literally the price of a cup of coffee, the town had already been dying, unremarked upon, for 2 full generations before anybody outside the King Country noticed. Entire streets today stand with houses boarded up right next to houses still occupied, with businesses that closed 30 or 40 years ago still carrying their original hand-painted signage bolted to the front, weathered but legible, and a main street built for a population several times the size of the one that remains. The mine that built the town closed in stages through the 1960s as national coal demand shifted and larger, more mechanized open-cast operations elsewhere made Ohura's small underground workings uneconomic almost overnight. What nobody in central or local government ever quite addressed in any formal policy document anyone can point to was what should happen to a town once the single thing that justified its existence disappeared. No formal decision was ever made to wind Ohura down, no relocation scheme, no planned closure. It simply wasn't propped up by anything after the mine went, and it has spent 60 years since finding its own level in near silence. Drive through today and you'll see it plainly. A town built for the size of a small suburb, currently home to roughly the population of a large extended family. Number 8. Seacliff, on the coast north of Dunedin, once home to what was, for a time, the largest building in the entire country. Seacliff Lunatic Asylum opened in 1884, an extraordinary and genuinely imposing piece of Victorian institutional architecture. All turrets and dark basalt stone, built on ground so geologically unstable that parts of the structure began visibly subsiding almost as soon as construction finished. A warning from the site's own engineer that the colonial government of the day chose, for reasons of cost, not to properly heed. For decades it operated as the South Island's principal psychiatric institution, and its documented history includes exactly the kind of institutional cruelty that era's asylums have since become known for nationally. Severe overcrowding, physical restraint used as routine management rather than emergency measure, and treatments that would today, without question, be classified as abuse rather than care. In December 1942, fire broke out in Ward 5, a locked women's ward on an upper floor. 37 patients died, unable to escape because the ward had been secured from the outside as standard practice in what remains one of the worst institutional fire disasters in New Zealand's history, and one of the deadliest single building fires the country has ever recorded. An official inquiry followed. Blame was formally apportioned to specific staffing and building failures, and fire safety procedures across the entire mental hospital system were changed as a direct result. The main building itself was eventually demolished in stages through the 1950s and into the 1960s, judged too structurally dangerous and too expensive to maintain on its unstable foundations. What remains today is scattered foundations, cellar walls half buried in gorse, and a spread of institutional debris and bush that has grown back thickly over what was once one of the most architecturally imposing buildings in the entire country. The site draws paranormal investigators with some regularity and draws formal complaints to the Dunedin City Council with almost equal regularity from residents concerned about unauthorised visitors on land that technically has never been formally opened for general public access. The official position, repeated in council correspondence over the years, is that it's simply an unsafe historic site, requiring caution. The unofficial one, passed down locally with the kind of flat, matter-of-fact certainty that doesn't feel like it needs any documentation to back it up, is that 37 women never really finished leaving that hillside. If that one unsettles you, hang on, because it's not the last time tonight we're going to be talking about a place where the ground itself seems to remember more than the official paperwork ever managed to. Number 7. Bullendale, deep in the Skipper's Canyon backcountry of central Otago, reachable only by a four-wheel drive track that has ended more than one rental car agreement early, and stranded more than one overconfident tourist for an uncomfortable night. Bullendale doesn't look like much today, a scatter of stone foundations and rusted machinery in a valley so remote the gold rush that built it has been over for well more than a century, and the silence out there has a particular quality to it, the kind you only get a long way from any road. What made Bullendale matter wasn't the gold itself, which was respectable but never spectacular by the standards of the wider Otago goldfields. It was the power station. In 1885, engineers built New Zealand's first hydroelectric generating station right here, harnessing the fall of Skipper's Creek to run electric arc lighting and stamping machinery for the mine, putting Bullendale, a settlement of a few dozen souls at most, ahead of most of the country's actual cities, which were still lighting their main streets by gas at the time. For a brief, genuinely remarkable period, this isolated mining camp had electric light before most of Dunedin did. The mine and the power station operated on into the early 20th century, before the accessible gold thinned out and the whole operation was abandoned to the tussock and the weather within the space of a few short years. What draws quiet, ongoing controversy among the handful of historians who've dug into the surviving paperwork isn't the mining at all. It's the timeline of the shutdown. Surviving correspondence from the mining company's later years suggests the power station's true construction and maintenance cost was never fully disclosed to its outside investors, several of whom lost significant money when the company folded, despite the mine. According to the same correspondence, reportedly still producing payable ore at the exact time operations ceased. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained why a working mine, with its own electric power supply, genuinely ahead of its time in every visible respect, simply stopped rather than pushed on. Number 6. Macetown, further still up the Arrow River from Arrowtown, another Otago gold town, reached today by fording the Arrow River more than 24 times along a single access track, a detail that keeps casual weekend visitors well away and gives Macetown a kind of stillness that towns closer to the main highway simply don't get to keep. At its peak in the 1870s, Macetown held around 200 people, its own school, a post office, and several hotels catering to men working quartz reef gold rather than the easier alluvial gold that had built Arrowtown a short distance downstream. Reef gold required far more capital and far more machinery than simply panning a riverbed, and as extraction costs rose and yields steadily fell through the closing decades of the 19th century and into the early 20th, the town emptied out gradually rather than all at once, the way most reef mining towns of that era tended to fade rather than collapse. By the 1930s it was, for all practical purposes, empty. Today, the Department of Conservation maintains a small handful of restored buildings as an official heritage site for the walkers and mountain bikers who make the crossing. But the surrounding hillsides remain scarred with dozens of old mine adits, some properly fenced off, plenty simply left open, leading back into workings nobody has comprehensively mapped since the last miners walked out for the final time. Prospectors and heritage surveyors still occasionally report finding evidence of shafts and drives that don't appear anywhere on the historical mining company plans lodged with the Otago Goldfields wardens back in the day. Workings that were either never officially recorded in the first place, or were recorded once and then quietly struck from later official surveys, for reasons the departmental archive holds no explanation for at all. Number 5. Denniston on a wind-scoured plateau above Westport on the west coast. A place so relentlessly exposed that the old joke among the miners who lived up there was that Denniston had exactly 2 seasons every year: winter and a fortnight of genuinely bad weather. Coal was found here in the 1870s, and by the time full-scale mining got underway, the real engineering challenge was never digging the coal out. It was getting it safely down off the plateau to the coast. The Denniston Incline, opened in 1880, remains one of the most extraordinary pieces of industrial engineering this country has ever produced. A self-acting rail incline, dropping loaded coal wagons a full 510 metres down a slope so steep, it reportedly terrified more than one visiting colonial official. At speeds where the descending full wagons pulled the empty ones back up on their own weight through a simple cable system, no engine required, gravity doing essentially all of the work. At its peak, the plateau held a genuine township of around 1,500 people, complete with its own school, a small hospital and a hotel, living in conditions so harsh that infant mortality figures recorded in Bulla district health reports from the period were markedly, measurably higher than the national average of the time. A statistic local historians have long argued was noted at the time, but never properly investigated by the colonial health authorities who compiled it. The mine finally closed in 1967 as underground coal mining nationally gave way to larger, cheaper open-cast operations elsewhere on the coast. Today, the plateau is maintained as a heritage walkway, the incline's rusted winding machinery preserved exactly in place as a monument to what was built there, and what's left of the actual township is little more than foundations sitting in tussock, whipped by the same relentless wind that made living up there such a well-documented ordeal for the families who did it. The old coal corporation's own historical reports acknowledge the settlement's harsh living conditions in general, careful terms, but stop well short of ever addressing directly why a company with the engineering resources to build one of the genuine marvels of colonial industrial design never meaningfully improved the basic housing of the men, women, and children who actually worked and lived it. Number 4. Port William on the northern coast of Rakiura, Stewart Island at the very bottom of the country, a place where dense native bush comes right down to a beach most visitors only ever glimpse from the deck of the ferry, heading toward the Ulva Island track. Long before it was a stop on the Rakiura Great Walk, Port William was a working settlement, sawmilling first, exploiting the island's dense native timber, then briefly a whaling and sealing base through the 19th century, working the same southern waters that today form part of a protected marine reserve. The physical remains are modest compared to some of the sites on this list. An old jetty, collapsing timber pilings still visible at low tide if you know exactly where to look, and the faint outline of a tramway that once hauled milled timber down to waiting ships. What makes Port William worth including here isn't scale, it's how quickly and how completely it was abandoned. Sawmilling and whaling both wound down within a few short years of each other in the early 20th century, as both industries became uneconomic on this particular stretch of coast, and the settlement, never especially large to begin with, essentially vanished, leaving almost no detailed written record of exactly how many people lived there at its peak, or precisely when the last families finally left for good. Rakiura's genuine isolation, remote even by the standards of a country that considers itself remote, meant nobody in Wellington was keeping close enough track at the time to properly notice, let alone formally document, the settlement's final days as they happened. Ngāi Tahu, whose customary connection to Rakiura long predates any of the industries that briefly and profitably operated here, hold their own oral history of this exact coastline, a history the settler written record never fully captured, and was arguably never really trying to. Between the gap in the official paper trail and the knowledge that was simply never written down to begin with, Port William's final chapter belongs, in the end, to nobody's complete official record at all. Subscribe to show that these videos actually help and that they make sense to keep making. It genuinely does make a difference on my end, more than most people watching probably realize, and it costs you nothing but a tap. Number 3. Kaimanawa technically the Kaimanawa Wall, sitting right on the edge of the Waiouru military training area on the central plateau of the North Island, on land the New Zealand Army has used for live fire exercises for decades and continues to use today. In 1996, a rock formation on this land came to sudden and fairly intense public attention. A face of what appeared to be enormous, precisely cut rectangular stone blocks stacked in neat horizontal courses like a deliberately engineered wall, rising several meters straight out of the surrounding hillside. It generated genuine international media interest at the time, including serious-sounding theories that it might represent physical evidence of a pre-Maori civilization, structures built by an earlier people that conventional history had otherwise erased entirely from the record. The University of Auckland's archaeology department investigated the site directly and concluded, based on close geological examination, that the formation was entirely natural, a product of columnar jointing in ignimbrite rock, the exact same volcanic process responsible for the more famous basalt columns seen elsewhere around the country, weathered by wind and water over tens of thousands of years into shapes that simply happened to strongly resemble deliberate human stonework. That's the official scientific answer, and it's the one accepted by mainstream New Zealand archaeology without any serious ongoing academic dispute. It's worth saying plainly, and I'll say it plainly, that no credible physical evidence of a pre-Maori civilization has ever actually been found anywhere in New Zealand, and claims to the contrary simply aren't supported by the archaeological record as it currently stands. What has kept the story genuinely alive for almost 30 years now isn't real scientific doubt about the underlying geology at all. It's the setting the wall happens to sit in. The formation sits on active military land, and access to it is genuinely, physically restricted, for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with the rocks themselves, and everything to do with unexploded ordnance and live-fire training exercises that make the surrounding land legitimately dangerous to wander into uninvited. That restriction alone has been enough, for the better part of 3 decades, to let a naturally occurring rock formation carry the full symbolic weight of a story about what this country supposedly doesn't want ordinary people finding out. Sometimes the fence really is the mystery, not whatever happens to be sitting behind it. Number 2. Maungapohatu, deep in Te Urewera, Tuho country, reached today only on foot, or by direct arrangement with the iwi whose land it sits on, and rightly so. In the early years of the 20th century, a Tuho prophet named Rua Kinana established a community here that he called the New Jerusalem, a settlement organized around his own distinctive religious and political vision, blending Maori spirituality with elements of Old Testament prophecy, at a time when Tuho had already lost enormous tracts of ancestral land to crown confiscation, and were actively, deliberately, organizing their own community outside the reach of Pakeha government control. At its height, Maungapohatu was home to several hundred residents, complete with its own purpose-built council house and a way of communal life deliberately structured to be self-sufficient and independent. In April of 1916, police raided the settlement in force, ostensibly to arrest Rua, on an outstanding warrant relating to the sale of alcohol, a charge many historians have since characterized as a pretext for a larger political objective. In the confrontation that followed, gunfire broke out, and Rua's own son, Toko, was shot and killed, along with another man named Te Maipi Te Wiu. Rua himself was arrested on the spot, later tried, and eventually imprisoned, and the community he had painstakingly built began a steady decline in the years that followed, hollowed out both by his physical absence and by the same relentless pressures that had shaped Tuho's dispossession for a full century before that single raid ever took place. Today, Maungapohatu is largely returned to bush, its few remaining structures cared for according to tikanga, rather than opened up as any kind of tourist attraction. And access is something you formally arrange with genuine respect, not something you simply turn up expecting. The government's own historical accounts, including detailed material produced during the treaty settlement process negotiated directly with Tuho, have formally acknowledged the 1916 raid as an act of disproportionate state violence against a community that posed no credible threat, though the full detail of exactly what was decided in Wellington in the lead-up to that raid, and by which specific officials, has never been laid out in complete, unredacted official form to this day. Whether that remaining gap is simple historical oversight, or something closer to a quiet admission depends very much on who you ask, and the answer you get will likely tell you more about the person answering than it ever will about 1916 itself. Some places on a list like this carry weight that has nothing to do with mystery at all, and everything to do with what was deliberately taken from the people who built them. Maungapohatu is one of those places, and I think it deserves to be remembered as exactly that. Number 1. It's fitting, in a way, that a list built around places nobody can fully explain ends not with a single building at all, but with an open question about origins themselves. Scattered across the North Island, through farmland, forest and coastal headland alike, are hundreds upon hundreds of PA sites. The earthworks of fortified Maori settlements, terraced hillsides, with defensive ditches and banks still clearly visible today after centuries of weather. Some individually dated by archaeologists to as early as the 14th century. Most of these sites are well understood by the people who study them, at least in general outline. Defensive structures reflecting a society organised around iwi and hapu, built, occupied, and rebuilt across many successive generations of continuous use. But a genuinely small number of these specific sites present an unresolved puzzle to the archaeologists who have spent careers studying them closely. Certain terracing and ditch alignments at a handful of individual PA, most notably examined in academic surveys conducted around parts of the Bay of Plenty and the Waikato over the past few decades, show construction techniques and an overall scale that some researchers have argued in published, peer-reviewed work exceed what would reasonably have been necessary for the known population levels of the immediate area at the time they were most likely built, or that appear on current radiocarbon evidence to predate the earliest widely accepted dates for large-scale Polynesian settlement of the interior, by a margin that available dating methods have never fully managed to close or explain away. Mainstream New Zealand archaeology treats these specific anomalies as most likely reflecting gaps in radiocarbon calibration and genuinely incomplete excavation records, rather than any evidence of an entirely separate earlier population, and that remains, quite reasonably, the position with the actual weight of scientific evidence behind it. But the honest answer, the one working archaeologists on these exact sites will sometimes give you off the record over a beer, rather than in a formal peer-reviewed paper, is that a small handful of specific dates from a small handful of specific excavation trenches still genuinely don't sit comfortably alongside the rest of the accepted picture, and nobody has yet gone back with the funding or the institutional appetite to properly resolve exactly why not. It isn't a hidden civilization waiting to be discovered. It's something smaller than that, and in its own quiet way, more honest. An open admission that even in a country as thoroughly surveyed and as carefully studied as this one has been, there are still specific stubborn details sitting in the ground that the official story hasn't entirely managed to catch up to yet. 15 places, forts nobody ever finished fighting from, mines that stopped for reasons buried as deep as the ore they were chasing, whole towns the country simply let go of one street at a time, and an old formation of rock that turned out to be the mountain's own patient handiwork rather than anybody's ancestors after all. What strikes me, looking back across the whole list, is that very few of these places were ever actually secret in any dramatic sense. Most of them sit on ordinary public land, or on land you can arrange to visit properly with the right permission and the right respect. The forbidding part, in almost every single case, was never really a locked gate at the end of the day. It was time and weather, and a country that kept moving forward before it ever quite finished writing down exactly what had happened at each of these places while there were still people alive who remembered it firsthand. New Zealand doesn't really hide its ruins so much as it simply stops looking at them after a while, and lets the bush quietly do the rest of the work. If you've been to any of the 15 places on this list and noticed something I haven't mentioned here tonight, I would genuinely like to know about it. Leave it in the comments below. I do read every single one of them, even the long ones. I am a grandpa, and grandpas worry. Look after yourselves out there.